At first look, 3I/Atlas appears to be doing exactly what any interstellar object is expected to do. It enters the solar system, passes through, dims with distance, and eventually disappears back into the darkness. End of story. Case closed. But as scientists refine the newest orbital calculations, something quietly disrupted that simple narrative. This object isn't merely departing. It's navigating through one of the most delicate gravitational regions anywhere in the solar system, a zone where even microscopic changes can completely rewrite an object's future. And the more closely astronomers examined its motion, the harder it became to dismiss a disturbing question. What if 3I/Atlas isn't just leaving? What if it's aligning itself? As Atlas continues outward, its projected trajectory brings it alarmingly close to a boundary few people ever hear about: Jupiter's Hill sphere. This invisible frontier marks the point where Jupiter's gravity begins to overpower the Sun's influence, a fragile handoff where gravitational control changes ownership. Current projections show Atlas skimming this boundary, not diving deep enough to be captured, but not passing safely wide either. It misses full capture by an astronomically tiny margin. And that almost is what sparked the debate. If the object passed, well, clear, there would be nothing to question. But drifting this close places Atlas in one of the most dynamically sensitive environments in the solar system, where even slight changes in speed or orientation could dramatically alter its path. In this region, gravity behaves less like a smooth curve and more like a blade's edge. Tip one way, and the object escapes forever. Tip the other, and its destiny changes completely. That's when some researchers began asking a deeply uncomfortable question. What if this path isn't random? Not because rocks make decisions, but because gravity itself can be used. Jupiter isn't just a planet. It's a gravitational amplifier capable of stealing energy, donating momentum, and reshaping trajectories with ruthless efficiency. In theory, a precisely tuned encounter could use Jupiter's gravity to radically redirect an object's course, even send it back toward the inner solar system. At first, that idea sounds absurd. Natural objects don't aim. Comets don't break intentionally. They follow gravity, lose energy, and continue onward. But Atlas hasn't behaved like a typical object from the beginning. That's why some scientists are no longer asking whether this scenario is likely, but whether it's physically possible under known physics, without resorting to science fiction or impossible technology. Strip away the fantasy. No warp drives. No exotic shortcuts. Just extreme engineering applied to familiar laws. And that's where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because the laws themselves don't forbid it. To understand how extreme this would be, the numbers matter. Atlas is moving at roughly 58 kilometers per second relative to the Sun-Jupiter orbits, at about 13 kilometers per second. To meaningfully alter Atlas's path using a gravity assist, it would need to shed more than 30 kilometers per second of velocity before reaching the correct encounter geometry. That represents an obscene amount of energy. Even if the object were partially hollow and far less massive than it appears, we're still talking about billions of tons. Chemical propulsion fails immediately. Its exhaust velocities are far too low. Ion propulsion improves efficiency, but its thrust is so weak that scaling it to something this massive becomes unrealistic in both time and energy. Only when plasma-based propulsion enters the discussion does the idea stop being trivial. Magnetically confined plasma engines already exist in experimental form. In principle, accelerating charged particles to hundreds or even thousands of kilometers per second could drastically reduce the required propellant. The real barrier then becomes power. Sustaining such a system for weeks or months would demand energy output far beyond anything humanity can currently produce. But that doesn't violate physics. It only defines a technological threshold. Extreme, yes. Impossible, no. At this point, the most unsettling idea emerges because it bypasses the hardest problem entirely. What if Atlas never intended to change its own trajectory? What if the objective isn't to redirect the entire object, but to release something smaller as it passes through Jupiter's gravitational influence. Slowing a payload of only a few tons is still a monumental challenge, but no longer absurd. Concepts like magnetic sail coupling suddenly become relevant, where a plasma stream interacts with a magnetic structure on a much smaller payload, efficiently transferring momentum. In this case, the energy source wouldn't need to be carried by the payload at all. It could reside with the larger system. This is where the persistent anti-tail of Atlas takes on a more unsettling meaning. The structure is composed of highly energetic particles moving against the solar wind. If it were not entirely natural, it could function as an enormous magnetic structure interacting with solar plasma, capable not just of transferring momentum, but of harvesting energy on a colossal scale. Even minimal efficiency across something that large would yield staggering power. And then the question shifts again. Why Jupiter? Why now? Atlas's trajectory has already carried it near Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, all scientifically strategic locations. Earth is the glaring exception. A Jovian interaction could reposition the system for a future return to the inner solar system with far more favorable geometry. This interpretation may be wrong. There may be a natural explanation we haven't uncovered yet. But none of these scenarios violate physics. They demand extreme technology, but not magical technology. And even if Atlas turns out to be completely natural, its behavior already places it among the strangest interstellar objects ever observed. The path it takes near Jupiter may resolve many questions, or raise far more disturbing ones. Either way, one thing is certain. This object isn't finished surprising us. What makes this phase of the trajectory so unsettling is how unforgiving the region truly is. Near the edge of Jupiter's gravitational dominance, motion stops being smooth and intuitive. This is a transition zone where trajectories can flip outcomes with almost no warning. A change of just a few meters per second, an orientation shift barely measurable at interplanetary scales, can determine whether an object escapes forever or becomes dynamically entangled for decades. Most interstellar visitors never come near this boundary. They cut clean arcs through the solar system and vanish. Atlas is doing something very different. It's threading the needle. The margins are so small that uncertainty itself becomes dangerous. This is the kind of region mission designers obsess over because it amplifies mistakes and rewards precision. For a natural object, such precision would be meaningless luck. For an engineered scenario, it would be the entire point. If Atlas behaved like a typical comet or asteroid, this near miss would be unremarkable. Accidental gravity assists happen all the time, but they usually produce clean outcomes: capture, deflection, or escape. Here, the object approaches the boundary, grazes it, and continues along a path that appears optimized for sensitivity rather than safety. Natural bodies gain no advantage from flirting with instability. There is no benefit to hovering near a gravitational tipping point unless something downstream depends on it. And this is where the discomfort deepens. Every anomaly already associated with Atlas, its non-gravitational acceleration, its persistent anti-tail, its internal activity, its strange mass-to-brightness ratio, becomes more significant when the trajectory itself enters a regime where small forces suddenly matter a great deal. Once the possibility of releasing something smaller is considered, the puzzle rearranges itself. A large object doesn't need to dismantle itself if its role is simply to deliver payloads into carefully selected gravitational environments. Near Jupiter's sphere of influence, even modest velocity changes on a small body could lead to long-term stability in regions associated with gravitational balance, regions known for allowing objects to linger with minimal energy expenditure. From there, the system could quietly persist for years, decades, or longer. Observationally discrete, dynamically stable. In this framework, the main body of Atlas functions less like a target and more like a carrier. The question stops being why the object is doing this and becomes what would benefit from being left there. Everything circles back to energy and structure. Redirecting the full object remains implausible. Redistributing energy internally does not. The anti-tail, those energetic particles pushing against the solar wind, suddenly matters in a different way. Structures like this aren't just visual anomalies. They represent massive interaction cross-sections with plasma flows. Even at extremely low efficiency, the scale involved allows meaningful energy transfer. Timing is the final piece. This isn't a random past millions of years early or late. It's happening now, after close encounters with Venus and Mars, after extensive observation, and before permanent escape. Whether entirely natural or not, the sequence itself is remarkable. The object enters, reveals anomalies, approaches one of the most powerful gravitational tools in the solar system, and does so along a path where tiny changes could produce enormous consequences. That alone guarantees continued scrutiny. Near Jupiter's gravitational frontier, the usual hierarchy of forces quietly collapses. In most of the solar system, gravity dominates so completely that minor accelerations barely register. But at the edge of a Hill sphere, the system becomes exquisitely sensitive. Non-gravitational forces that would normally be dismissed, outgassing asymmetries, plasma interactions, even subtle momentum exchange with the solar wind, suddenly gain leverage. For Atlas, this sensitivity changes how we interpret everything we already know. Its small but persistent non-gravitational acceleration stops being a curiosity and starts becoming dynamically relevant. It doesn't need dramatic thrust. It only needs consistency. In a knife-edge region, persistence beats power. And that is exactly the pattern Atlas has displayed since its discovery. If the goal were long-term presence rather than dramatic maneuvering, discretion would be essential. Regions near gravitational balance provide exactly that. Objects placed carefully can remain stable for long periods while remaining observationally quiet, especially if they're small, dark, and not actively outgassing. This reframes the trajectory yet again. The near miss with Jupiter's domain isn't about capture. It's about access. Access to a region where something could remain without constant correction, without burning energy, and without drawing attention. From that vantage point, the Jovian system becomes a laboratory, and the inner solar system a distant target. What makes 3I/Atlas impossible to dismiss is not any single anomaly, but how all of them converge precisely where the consequences are highest. An object with persistent non-gravitational acceleration enters one of the most sensitive gravitational regions in the solar system. An object shedding material in structured ways approaches a boundary where tiny forces suddenly matter. An object that refuses to behave passively arrives at a point where passivity would normally be expected. This is not proof of anything extraordinary, but it is a warning that the simple explanation no longer holds. The trajectory is doing the talking now. Near Jupiter's gravitational frontier, chance stops being forgiving. Small effects compound. Minor asymmetries amplify. Outcomes split sharply. Whether Atlas is entirely natural or something far less familiar, this encounter represents a pivot, not an ending. The object doesn't need to turn around to change its fate. It only needs to pass close enough for the rules to bend. And that is exactly what is happening. Science advances at moments like this. Not when answers are comfortable, but when models begin to strain and curiosity refuses to quiet down. The next phase of Atlas's journey will either reinforce our understanding of interstellar visitors or force us to refine it in ways we weren't prepared for. Either outcome matters, because if even one interstellar object can linger, reposition, or subtly reshape its path using known physics alone, then the solar system isn't just a crossroads. It's a place where stories can continue. If you want to follow this as the data evolves, like the video, so this analysis reaches others who care about evidence over assumptions. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update as the Jupiter interaction unfolds. And leave a comment with the most conservative explanation you think still fits everything we've seen so far. Because one thing is already clear. 3I/Atlas isn't done yet. And neither is the question it's forcing us to ask. I'd love to hear what you think about this, so drop a comment below. If you enjoyed our conversation today, Please share this video and subscribe to help the channel grow. Every bit of support counts.